Hello again. Welcome back to another Live at 5. I'm your curator with Kevin Adkison, coming to you live today from the historic Cranbrook School for Boys, designed by Eliel Saarinen and others. It opened for classes in 1927. And on today's Live at 5 tour, we will be looking at some of the art and architecture of the Schools for Boys campus. Now, 2 weeks ago, I guess it is, we did the architecture of Kingswood School for Girls. That was also Eliel Saarinen. That building was designed and completed between 1930 and 1931, built all at once with Mrs. Booth's financial support. The boys' school is a little bit different. The boys' school was again designed by Eliel Saarinen, but this time he had help in the form of some young assistants and a very engaged client. He also built it over a number of years because this whole idea of building a preparatory school was something that was new, that George Booth wasn't quite certain how it would work out or exactly how he would launch the school. And so thank you all for joining us for this tour today. Again, I'm Kevin Adkison, the curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And I want to start this tour just getting our bearing here at the School for Boys. This piece of property, prior to becoming a preparatory school, and now a co-educational preparatory school, this was the site of Cranbrook Farm Group number 2. George Booth, when he bought the land starting in 1904 until about 1906 to assemble what the extent of his initial purchase, he actually purchased up a number of different farms and mills. And so he rehabbed those farms from about 1906 to 1912, building 2 main farm groups. And the only part of the farm group that survives are the old dairy buildings straight ahead, and then the dormitory for bachelor farmers, which was here. And then the rest of the farm group, which was designed by Albert Kahn, and it's using the Kahn system of concrete blocks. Here was the hay barn, where the tower is. This was where the grain silo was. The horses' stables were here in the classroom building. And then there was the wagon shop, the implement shop, and then the blacksmith's forge, where the library and study halls are. Interestingly, as late as 1932, there was still a farm building sitting in the middle of the quadrangle, so it wasn't all open. Now, how did it come to be that we went from a farm group on this site to a classroom building for boys? Well, George Booth, as I mentioned last week in our tour of Brookside, his father taught Sunday school to the farmers here on the property. As the community grew, George and Ellen became interested in opening an Episcopal church here in the countryside. And so as Christ Church Cranbrook came into fruition, the need for a boys' choir became a pressing issue. And so George Booth thought, I'll build a choir school and then have my choir on Sundays. Now, the rector Marquis suggested to George Booth that a choir school would be quite limiting, and instead he should build a secular school detached from the Christ Church Cranbrook. And so Eliel Saarinen comes into the picture about this point. The church was built by Bertram Goodhue Associates of New York. Saarinen at the time was instructor in architecture at the University of Michigan. He had immigrated here to America from Finland in 1922-23 with his family. He was teaching the Booth's youngest son, Henry Scripps Booth. And Henry Booth designed a school for boys as a hypothetical senior project. Little did Saarinen, his instructor, know that it was in fact a real project. The Saarinens had multiple ways of meeting each other. That's a longer story for a longer tour. But by 1925, Eliel Saarinen was hired on as consultant, not architect, consultant to this new Cranbrook experiment. And so the initial buildings are actually Eliel Saarinen, architect and consultant with Henry Booth and Henry Booth's best friend, J. Robert F. Swanson. Swanson was from the Upper Peninsula. He was the Saarinen's translator in University of Michigan. They only spoke German, Finnish, Swedish, Russian, and French. Swanson served as the translator. He was an architecture student and then eloped with the Saarinen's daughter and became their son-in-law. And Bob Swanson, Henry Booth, and Eliel Saarinen work out the initial design for Hoey Hall, the classroom building. And George Booth was also deeply, deeply invested in the design of these buildings. Eliel Saarinen said that there's no building at Cranbrook that's not half a George Booth building. Eliel Saarinen would often get directives if he designed something that Booth didn't like. George Booth would tell Saarinen, "Why don't you go back and design something we both like?" And if Saarinen didn't want to do that or didn't believe in it, he would make an argument as to why his design solution was appropriate. And usually George Booth would go with it. But I do think the many hands that were involved in designing the school give it that very eclectic architecture. We're going to head inside. We'll be going into a number of different spots today. Now that we know a little bit of the history, when the school opened in September of 1927, there were 74 students. 59 of those were boarding students. There were only seven instructors, and the only buildings were the classroom building here and then the initial dormitory building here. So everything else, the dining hall, the library, would open up within about 3 years of classes starting. I love this detail here, how you have the cast concrete, the cast stone mullions dividing the windows, and then these load-bearing brick arches that are supporting tinier brick arches above them. And those tiny arches almost act like little miniature models. They are too load-bearing. All of these brick walls are structural, but here this is sort of non-required load-bearing arches. And if we get closer to them, we'll see that they're not actually bricks. They are the roofing tiles of the building used as bricks. And so we then head in past these two tetrarchs. These are Italian, from the Venetian Ravenna area. These are from this Venetian Republic, and they're judges. And the way that Saarinen and Booth placed the tetrarchs here is exactly modeled after the Doge's palace in Venice. And so you have this sort of idea of republican democracy, of no empire here at Cranbrook School. And we're going to see Venice as a constant inspiration in the design of the school. Now we come into the main lobby space here, and I'll just give you a sense of the lobby, and then we'll look at some of the items more closely. In the lobby here, we'll start by looking at this 1933 reproduction of the original charter of Cranbrook School in England. Cranbrook is a little village in Kent, south of London. And in 1933, the headmaster of Cranbrook School, Cranbrook, came to a visit to the new Cranbrook School, Bloomfield Hills. This is the seal of Elizabeth I. This is a 16th century seal. Interestingly, Cranbrook School in England was established, there is Elizabeth, was established by a noted weaver. Cranbrook was a weaving village, and it was a wealthy weaver who established the first Cranbrook School. And of course, the Booth family they immigrated from Cranbrook, Kent County, England in the 1840s to New York, Pittsburgh, and then Toronto. And so the Cranbrook Booths, as well as the Cranbrook Scripses, Mrs. Booth, were English. And this whole campus has this very English arts and crafts style to it. On the fireplace here, this is all Pewabic pottery tile, designed by Eero Saarinen. The fireplace was designed by Eliel, and then the little tiles were designed by his son, Eero. Eero studied sculpture as a child. His mother was a sculptor. And so these tiles that are different athletic sport figures, we have the tennis player here, were sculpted when he would have been 16 or 17 years old. So I don't know what you were doing as a teenager, but I know that my father, the dentist, did not give me the opportunity to make handmade pottery fireplaces. We have the baseball player here, the C for Cranbrook on the football team. In the early years, Cranbrook played not only the public schools, but it played regional private schools, and it also played itself. So the boys were divided into multiple houses that had their own school colors and their own school banners, and they would do intramural sports as well. The first headmaster of Cranbrook schools was a gentleman named William O. Stevens, and Dr. Stevens he was fifth generation American educator. He had studied undergraduate at Colby College in Maine. He got his doctorate of literature from Yale. He taught for about 20 years at the Naval Academy in Annapolis and was teaching at a prep school in New York when he came out here to become the first headmaster of Cranbrook School. And Cranbrook was the first non-parochial, non-military boarding school in Michigan. And part of Dr. Stevens' role was in convincing Michigan families to send their children here for prep school and not back east. He had a big push against parents like Edsel and Eleanor Ford, like the Booths themselves, sending their children back east for prep school. He was successful. He was known for his insistence on good manners and sort of orderly conduct, never allowing anyone under the age of 6 years old on the campus, certainly not at dinner. And he really did establish the sort of feeling of the early school. He also established our school colors, royal blue and silver gray, which are the colors of Colby College, coming from the end of the Civil War as a sort of reunification to use those blue and gray colors. So this fireplace was here on day one. They would have been studying underneath the fire, which was held in andirons, which are designed by the Booths. So George Booth, of course, a great iron worker before he was a newspaper man. And if we follow the fireplace tiles with this sort of geometric designs of the squares and squares and then the larger squares, we come up to the ceiling of the lobby, which is the only place in the School for Boys campus where the ceiling is exposed, the structural ceiling is exposed. These are one-way concrete rib slabs, so sort of concrete beams. They're 25.5 inches on center, which is a pretty standard way of building a fireproof building like this in the late 1920s. But what's unique about Saarinen's slabs here are that his daughter Pipsan Saarinen, who was a designer and fashion instructor at the academy, she designed these stencils. And they're slightly shimmering. I'm not sure if it's aluminum leaf here, which is what she would use at Kingswood. But Pipsan designs these stencils to ornament this wonderful concrete ceiling. And we have to think about concrete being a very modern material, and then these buildings not looking very modern to our eye. And so Saarinen was, probably very uninterested in industrialization and prefabrication and these or other sort of topics that preoccupied modernist architects. But like many arts and crafts architects, he wasn't against modern materials, he just used them in very traditional ways. And so he gives us this beam ceiling, not beams of wood, beams of concrete, and then his daughter does the decorative stencils on them. And you'd be hard-pressed to imagine someone like Le Corbusier, who is doing his most important work at this exact same time, 1927, ever stenciling his concrete modernist buildings in France. Now, on the floor is linoleum. I'm not sure here if this is the original linoleum, but linoleum is the correct material. I would not be surprised if this was the original linoleum. And then we get into the art that George Booth purchased for the School for Boys. George Booth was significantly more involved in the art and program of the School for Boys than he was at the School for Girls, which was again a gift of his wife. And so George Booth wanted to tie his campus to Venice, the early republic. And so this is a painting from about the 1690s to the 1710s. It's by Luca Carlevi. I have no idea how you say his name, but he's a Venetian painter. And he does this monumental scene of the Doge's palace. The tetrarchs that we saw outside would be right around this corner out of view. And you see the Piazza San Marco depicted in this painting. The Piazza San Marco is, especially after the Italian early 20th century urbanist Camillo Sitta, who really was this advocate of city planning as the pedestrian-oriented, irregular celebration of old Italian cities. People like architect Elio Saarinen become really invested in the Piazza San Marco as the perfect urban space. So if you read Elio Saarinen's 1944 book, The City, it's all about the Piazza San Marco being the sort of perfect form of urban space. I think for George Booth, the piazza represented something else. It had more to do with law and order and the early republic. But for both Saarinen and Booth, the Piazza San Marco would be very influential in their thinking about how to design space. And again, this has been here since day one here in the boys' school, and it was restored in 2000 by an alumni who I'm neglecting to recall the name, who generously helped restore that. We're also seeing some of the original furniture, the upholstered chairs. I want to next head up into the tower. We won't be going out onto the roof today, but I would be remiss if I did not show you a few of the sculptures and artworks here in the stair tower. So this is a load-bearing stone column with load-bearing brick arches, and if you get tired of me saying that things are load-bearing, it's just so unusual for a 20th century American building to not be using false fronts, to not just be putting the brick and then having steel behind it. Here is a sculpture by George Edwin Bissell, who was an American 19th century sculptor known for his Civil War monuments. This is the Greek philosopher Diogenes, who is the father of Cynic philosophy, and he is sort of wandering out across the stairway. And I don't know which came first, the purchase of the Bissell sculpture or the design of the pedestal. But I would say that Saarinen probably incorporated that stand in the original design. Now, through here is the main assembling hall for the School for Boys, and in this great vaulted space, it's centered on another fireplace with Booth andirons here. And then we see behind the andirons a print, this time again of Venice, I believe. Yes, the Venetian Republic. A lot of these prints were in the Booth collection and then given to the school. And then here we have a depiction of Columbus by G. Owen Bonawit. And Bonawit was a New York stained glass artist who had a huge stained glass facility in New York. He did much of the stained glass for the Gothic revival buildings that were going up across college campuses. He did the windows at Michigan Law. He did the windows at Yale. And he was known for his ability to take lithographs and then get them into stained glass forms. We see more of the original furniture still in use here, which delights me as a curator. And then we also see the original lighting fixtures, which you see have the little crane here, designed by Elio Saarinen. And so all of these details. Saarinen is conceiving this school as a total work of art. It is a little bit different than Kingswood, which is, of course, an Art Deco total work of art, where everything is very much cohesive in the design scheme. Here it's not as kind of universally applied as far as repeating certain motifs on end. Aristotle, he has been there since the school opened. Instead, here at the School for Boys, it is this total work of art where everything from the doorknob to the hinge to the light fixture to the wood paneling and furniture has all been considered, and everything has been selected for its beauty and contribution to the whole. We have reached the north lobby now, which is a two-story space, much grander than the south lobby. And you see this combination of sort of an English arts and crafts and the Finnish, almost Art Nouveau that Eliel Saarinen was practicing, within our great modernist example of a glass curtain wall. You would be hard-pressed to find this much glass in a true medieval English cottage. And then as we move through the space, you see that we've lost our concrete ceiling and we have a wood beam ceiling. Interestingly, these are real wooden beams that are truly supported by those other wooden beams and columns, but we're within a larger steel structure. So there is this sort of structural logic to what you see, but it's not what's actually supporting the roof, which I think is very interesting. There are these huge foot-square wooden columns, and then this amazing wooden summer beam that stretches across the entire Ingelducht. And it has this lobby, all the features of a 19th century proper Finnish home, something you might see in Newport, Rhode Island. You have the stair, you have the Ingelnook, you have the fireplace, you have the wooden beams. So it's very domestic. The scale of it becomes institutional, and then the details are where Saarinen really expresses himself. Because I imagine that George Booth asked for this room really quite literally. This is very much what George Booth, what his taste leaned towards. But then where Saarinen's genius comes in are in the use of bricks. You'll see how much larger that brick is than a standard brick, and then we get to a much smaller Roman brick. There are moments like this where the brick is pushed in and creates a little ledge, and then we move down and you'll see it's flush, and then here the bricks are tapering into this sort of telescope depression. Then you have over here another little detail where you have custom bricks that are, each individual one is cast into a different shape, creating this sort of sunburst around this little empty niche that fits within the larger brick coursing. And then more Booth-designed fireplace andirons, and then the seats. I love the Juliet balcony that leads up to the classrooms, and the classrooms don't have hallways. They're arranged one right after the other. So you've got to be timely, as Dr. Stevens wanted us to be, because one class cannot get out earlier than the next. And then there is the map, a map of North America depicting the principal expeditions of discovery and exploration. This was a commission by George Booth, done by the painter John Hessian, who was an American painter. And he did this as a proper fresco. So this is egg tempera, so egg yolk used to create paint mixed with pigment. A wet scrim of plaster would be placed over the wall, and then you would use the egg and dye mixture on top of the wet plaster, and it would soak into the plaster, and so this wall and the painting are one unit. They are impossible to separate. Now, the mural has been restored a couple of times, and luckily got these stanchions put on about the year 2000. Here we see some of the explorers and the title of the piece. The armillary sphere, which we will see in just a moment. Remember this image. And then you see the modes of exploration and of travel, starting from man on foot to the chariot and horse, to the stagecoach with multiple horses, to the locomotive, the automobile, and then the airplane here. And we also move from, I don't know who this is, let's just say it's Ponce de Leon. And then over here we get to Wilkie, and Wilkes, who flew across the North Pole in 1928 while this was being painted. That could be Lindbergh. I say that it's Wilkie because he is up there as well, flying across the North Pole, and he actually made that flight during the painting of this mural and was added to it. He was not originally going to be included. Now, there are sort of moments of colonization and conflict depicted. So you have the whaling industry, you have the ships, you have Hudson going up the Hudson, you have Toronto, where the Booths were from. Here is Cadillac, founder of Detroit. Then you have Lewis and Clark coming down in their canoe. You have the Oregon Trail moving across the country. Buffalo here. You have sites of conflict between U.S. forces and indigenous peoples. And then you have the Golden Spike put in here at the Transcontinental Railroad. And then you have the West Coast cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles. Cortez is down here in Mexico. And everyone has a legend. So that was not Lewis and Clark, or that was Lewis and Clark with the rifles. Who were the ship? Well, we're not sure. They're always good to have mystery in art. You also have the four winds depicted around within all of the explorers painted in the border of the fresco. Now, moving across, there was originally a painting here. I posted this to Instagram a moment ago, a painting by Burninghouse, who was the founder of the Taos Artist Colony. And it was a portrait of a indigenous man at the Taos Artist Colony with other indigenous people behind him in the Taos Colony. And I do think it's quite fascinating that in 1928, George Booth had established this sort of didactic relationship between the map of European colonialism to a painting of a native person on the other wall. Hopefully we can bring that back. I would love to have the painting again situated within this space. Notice we saw the brick that had telescoping squares. Here you see the woodwork having telescoping square, and all of this is solid wood joined together. There is no wood paneling at Cranbrook School for Boys. Kingswood is only wood veneer and plywood paneling. The boys' school is only solid wood. What's perplexing structurally is that these foot-by-foot wooden columns are the same dimension as the ones that are holding the roof. And so there's this sort of structural redundancy, overbuilding, in order to have the visual unity of these columns marching up. The light fixture, they did originally have round light bulbs like that in there. Now we're using LEDs. Next, we'll come into the old wagon shop. Again, the entire farm group was demolished and new buildings built on the site, but this was the wagon shop of 1912, and it became the study hall. We'll ignore the modern furniture, and we'll look up at these paintings done by Arrow and Pipson. Here you see, I'm not sure what they're doing, tug of war. Here you see campfire, warming their hands. If we turn around, we'll see more Sarnan children. I don't know. They look like they're in timeout. Here we have some sort of ball sport. Here they're connected by a bracelet. And then football is the next one. Originally, in the original drawings of this room, it had a loft area that would have looked down into the study hall. Here, the exposed wooden beams, these are actually structural, but interestingly, they support steel trusses that run across. So you have the wooden beams exposed, the steel behind the plaster, you have the one steel tie rod coming down, and then where the truss system meets this is actually a concrete beam that is skimmed in wood, and these funny little wooden covers are only there to cover the rivets that are helping hold this construction together. So again, this very confusing structural logic that Saarinen deploys. It's not exactly the most clear structural system, though it is very powerful when you're standing in this space. And I love the way that he uses these whimsical scrolls as these funny little column capitals. Now, we'll keep moving on into the original library, moving past some additional stained glass work by G. Owen Bonnewitt. Here in front of the library workroom, there are significant printers. So this is Jacob Stadelberger, who was a Bavarian printer, and you have Bavaria here, Zurich here, and Heidelberg here, so centers of learning. These are, again, modern pieces from the 1920s from the Bonnewitt studio. And then here you have a Parisian bookseller represented. And these probably, I haven't done the research, but they probably come from book plates in the Booth Library. And then we get into the Great Boys School Library Reading Room. Again, if you're just joining us, I'm Kevin Adkison, your curator with the Center for Collections and Research, and we're taking a tour of the historic Cranbrook School for Boys, which has been coeducational since the 1980s. In the library, it is dominated by this bas-relief panel, designed and carved by the Hungarian architect, archaeologist, painter, designer, sculptor, Géza Marotti. And this piece is called The Gift of Knowledge, and it is a sort of coming-of-age tale. And at the top, there is what Marotti referred to as the coming-of-age triptych. And so you have the young boy who is listening to a dove's heartbeat. It's illuminated by these windows. And so you have the boy holding the dove up and sort of learning about the natural world. And he's surrounded by his parents or his family who are sort of holding a ship for transportation, holding a staff, holding the bounty of the harvest. And then on this side, you have the young man who, notice he's the only figure who is not looking towards the center of the overmantel. So he's looking back and he's reaching out as sort of this longing reach towards some sort of path, perhaps resistance to growing up. You'll also notice that his brow is slightly furrowed, so he's looking sort of forlorn. And there's this great Saarinen-esque representation of the arts in front of it, representing craft and craftsmanship. And then in the center, you have the educated scholar who's wearing his Liberty cap, who is giving the diploma or the scroll to the young student who is sort of looking down, studying the words. And part of Géza Marotti's design here is to be slightly less than clear, to not exactly reveal exactly what is going on. So he never wrote an essay about this piece. He never described exactly what he intended it to be. But he wanted it so that as the students grew up and they got older in the school, they would notice new and different parts of the carving. Down below are different historical scenes, like Adam and Eve there. You have Noah, who is releasing the dove here. Keep in mind where the dove was. You have Babylon, you have Egypt, you have Moses with his 10 commandments. You have Jerusalem here. And then you get to Athens and Rome. And finally, you get to Attila, who, the argument goes, had Attila the Hun not invaded the Roman world, we would never have had English society. And so Attila is important to the creation of English culture. And then you have the first leader after the fall of the Roman Empire, and you have Ravenna burning. There's an essay online on the Center for Collections and Research website that talks with Dr. Jeffrey Welch. He wrote an essay about this piece, and he goes into much more detail. He points out that on the other side of the fireplace, we have the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and you have Columbus coming ashore, and who is leading Columbus but the same dove? And so it gives this sort of call and response that America is the natural outcome of all human history, that the dove has taken us from Noah to Columbus. And at the center, we have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This is Thomas Jefferson, and he writes that religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged. And so Cranbrook being a school here in the Northwest Territory, the state of Michigan, fulfilling Jefferson's edict. Now, those of you who went to University of Michigan, you might remember this line. It's carved in the Albert Kahn design Engel Hall, and it's carved atop sort of the great classroom building of University of Michigan. And George Booth actually, when he incorporated the Cranbrook Foundation in 1927, part of its establishment was that if anything happens to Cranbrook, it is deeded to the University of Michigan. So there's multiple sort of tie-ins with the ordinance in the University of Michigan. The rest of this room has books and lighting and reading tables. In the early years, when there were fewer books in the library, there were actually curtains that covered off those bookcases. And then as the library expanded, they would remove sections of the curtains. And over here is this wonderful globe stand that was recently restored by the class of 1957, designed by the great American decorator and furniture designer Henry Bacon. So Géza and Poldi Marotti, the Hungarian sculptor, and his wife, they had known Éliel Saarinen for many, many years. They were friends in Finland. They wrote letters to each other in German. That was their common language. Géza Marotti was Eero Saarinen's godfather. And so George Booth did not know the Marottis when he invited them here to Cranbrook, but he trusted Éliel Saarinen when Saarinen said he is the sculptor who understands the arts and crafts and who views architecture and sculpture as being one. Let's see, that was very strange. I don't know why I lost you, and I don't know if you'll come back. The Facebook app just closed on me, and I'm not sure why. But if you're still with me, we will try and finish up the tour here in the next 10 minutes. I do not know what just happened. It's the first time I've lost a tour. But I hope that some of you were with me on the first half of the tour, and I do just want to keep talking a little bit about Géza Marotti. So I mentioned that the Booths didn't know him. He was hired on the recommendation of the Saarinens. He was here from 1927 until 1929, and he left because he found Cranbrook just incredibly provincial, and he said he missed art, music, poetry, and culture. But in the short 2 years that Marotti was here, he also carved the doorway of knowledge, which the students will always tell you is always locked, which is great for a school. And around the door of knowledge, Marotti carved the fruits of Michigan into oak. And so you have pears, you have wheat, you have corn, berries, maybe. There are cherries down here, sunflowers. And so it is this sort of, the produce of Michigan, which is second only to California in the diversity of produce which is grown here. Marotti also, he had worked in North America. He worked in Mexico by 1909. But after he left Detroit, where he had worked on the Fisher Building, he worked at Cranbrook, he returned to his native Hungary, and he spent the war years in Hungary working on a epic tale of Atlantis. Here you see more fruits of Michigan carved by Géza Marotti, and you see the library door. The reason that these are always locked is not because we don't want the students to have knowledge, but that as originally designed, you had the study hall, the library, and the north lobby all as different buildings. Now, Cranbrook School's motto is Aim High, and this is a circa 1970 sculpture of the original 1928 school crest, which was an Eero Saarinen design of the Greek figure shooting the arrow up at the sky. Here you have the Galileo doorway, which I think is my personal favorite Geza Marotti sculpture at Cranbrook. You have Galileo, who is, of course, the founder of modern physics, and behind him is Echo. I don't speak Latin, but it means here it moves, which was his great proof that the sun was at the center of the world and we were spinning around it and not the other way around. And from the Galileo door, you would enter into the tower, which until 1931 had the telescope that you could go and you could study the stars. It moved to the Institute of Science. Now, around the Galileo doorway, you have other thought leaders in science. And so you have Archimedes down here. I'm not sure why they're represented by Kuti. I'm not sure that is Archimedes himself. Stevenson and Wright, Newton, Copernicus, the astronomy door. You have geology over here. So all the sciences, Columbus again, geography, biology. And interestingly, as far as process went, Marotti actually carved these in situ. So the door was already built, and then Marotti carved it after it was in place. That is not how most sculptures would have been working in the early 20th century. But here you see where Marotti never carved the design, and so you see the blocks of stone are still just blocks awaiting carving. Next on our list of sculptures is over here, the Armillary Sphere by Paul Manship. And Manship was a noted New York sculptor. There are 4 of these that were cast in Paris. This one was purchased by George Booth in 1926. It's a 1924 design. If you were with me on the first half, you'll know that it was painted into the map of principal explorations. And you see that Manship has the entire world resting on turtles, and then waves of the sea, and then mountains, and then here is the family unit at the center of the world. And around it are the sort of astronomical pieces, the rings, and cast into them are the zodiac that move around the whole piece. And Paul Manship, if you don't know his work, you'll know his piece in Rockefeller Center. He did Prometheus, which is the great golden god that you ice skate around in the winter. Now, we're going to conclude our tour moving into the dining hall. But before we get there, we'll stop and contemplate the central fountain. Those of you who were with me on Instagram yesterday, I talked about the Curizzi reproduction art foundry in Naples, Italy. This is another masterpiece of the Curizzi workshop, carved in the original, the marble, as the original is. It's a Byzantine piece from the Montreal Cathedral cloister. So the original is almost 1,000 years old. George Booth commissioned this piece in 1927 for the courtyard, after Henry Booth had seen it in his travels of 1922. And I love the little figures at the top. Those little faces all spout water, and the water drips down into the basin and then falls into the great octagonal pool. And so its placement at the center of the quadrangle means that you always hear the sort of pitter-patter of water as the classrooms and library spaces all open up towards this fountain. The tower was used as the telescope in the earliest years, and then after that, it was sort of made redundant by the Institute of Science, and so the students would take rappelling lessons, and they would drop down off of the tower. Now, the rest of the courtyard we'll save for another day of touring, but I want to take us into the dining hall next. This is Eliel Saarinen's largest public space at Cranbrook, and I think his most sort of imposing. The students call it Harry Potter. I take issue with that because there's really nothing Gothic about this building. It's very much a product of 1928, as much as it is a sort of 1428. This is a fountain that Eliel Saarinen designed that has never been in use because of those windows right behind it. So the water splashes in and then pours into the lower dining hall. This is the original gateway. So George Booth, as I mentioned, there were 74 students in the first class, and 59 of those were boarding students. So most of the students were boarders, even if majority of them came from Detroit and Pontiac, they were still boarding here. And so there is no original car turnaround. There is no sort of vehicular drop-off. The students that did walk to school were walking from local farms, or they were taking the interurban railway up Woodward Avenue, and then they would get off the trolley and they would have an omnibus that would drive them the mile down here. These great gates here are designed by Eliel Saarinen with the male and female peacocks on the top. And then you have the little child peacock down here. And these were restored in 1983, and then again about a decade ago when we made cast of all the doors in case anything ever gets bent. We know what the originals look like. And then we'll move into the dining hall, going past all these wonderfully curious architectural ornaments and different sort of geometric shapes, like the hexagon to the perfect semicircular base, or these funny little Ys here that are supporting these strange geometries. None of this is coming from any direct source in architectural history. It's all Saarinen's imagination, and his great expertise as an architect was taking all of architectural history, putting it into his mind, and then creating something that is utterly new, utterly original, but feeling familiar. So all of this feels very much like someplace you've been, someplace that belongs in an educational setting, but he never is copying from a direct source in Oxford or Cambridge. In the same time that this is being built, 1927 to 1931, is when you have the Law Quadrangle being built at Michigan, when you have Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, Bryn Mawr, all rebuilding themselves in the sort of quadrangle, neo-Gothic manner, which quadrangles are not native to American educational institutions. That is something that is imported in the 20s. Notice that the principal windows here on the dining room, the largest room, the most public room, are now bound in stone, and it looks like there are 5 windows going down the side, each which have different little stone ornaments. And then we'll head in to the dining room. And we see this great Finnish fantasy of a room where you have this enormous vaulted ceiling from which are suspended these light fixtures, which are actually Swedish lampshades. There are 4 Swedish lampshades from the Orifors company, flipped upside down and then repeated with custom glass finials and then brass detailing that catch the light as it moves up towards the ceiling. And then when I mentioned that there were 5 windows outside, you see here the stone encased windows are balanced by these little windows that are set directly into the brick on the outside, so that you end up with 11 bays of light coming into the space. And at the other end of the hall, you have this great window that the size of the windows descend as it gets higher, so it extends the view, makes it seem to go on forever. And the furniture in this room was designed by Eliel Saarinen in the arts and crafts style again. And in the back of the chairs, we see these little cranes, which were designed by Eero Saarinen, CS, Cranbrook School, 1928. Cranbrook meaning where the crane lands in Old English, and our mascot being the crane. This was my Halloween costume 2 years ago. And then Saarinen's tables, which are designed for this space as well. That top has been replaced with plywood, but this is the original oak top of the table. And there are armchairs, which now are all down there, but in the original configuration, the students sat casual for lunch. It was jacket and tie, formal for dinner, suit and tie, and you would have a male faculty member sitting here, and then you would have the boys lined up. One boy was the server, one was the runner. The server would serve each of his fellow classmates. The runner would run back and forth to the kitchen to get seconds, and then the faculty member would direct conversation across the table. And then here is where you would store the plates, which were designed by Saarinen, the silverware selected by Saarinen, the linens also selected by Saarinen. And of course, even the tie that the boys were wearing was woven in the weaving workshop by Mrs. Saarinen's weavers. So it was a pretty comprehensive aesthetic moment every night of the week. In the windows themselves, you'll notice each one is different. You probably can't tell through Facebook Live, but the windows are also tinted different colors. You can sort of see there where it's a slight purple. So it's purples and blues and turquoise and clear glass. And each design repeats about 5 times around the room, but in completely different orders. So you always get a different feel to each window. And then the last items that we'll talk about are these 2 columns. Remember our painting of Venice, where you had the 2 columns in the Piazza San Marco. Here they appear again. In between them is a Low Country Netherlands tapestry from about 1600. And then above them is the Oscar Bach clock. And you can look on the Cranbrook Kitchen Sink website. Just search Bach, B-A-C-H, clock, Cranbrook Kitchen Sink, to see a detailed photograph of the clock. Those are all different artisans, metalsmiths, blacksmiths at the 12 o'clock hand, weavers at the noon hour, 3 o'clock I think is a glass blower, 10 o'clock is the craftsman. And these are made out of bronze, iron, copper, brass, and aluminum. George Booth commissioned that piece and then placed it there. And then Eliel Saarinen designed the peacock andirons here. These were made by the Scottish blacksmith at Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios before the Academy of Art, a gentleman by the name of Burnett, who worked here until his death in 1930. And these are iron and steel peacocks on the original fireplace. So I hope that you all have enjoyed the tour today. We'll be back with another tour next. Can I get out? We'll be back with another tour next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Next week, I'll be coming from the Frank Lloyd Wright Design Smith House. The week after that, I'll be coming from the Academy of Art, and we'll do the exterior architecture of the Academy of Art. There are lots of other projects on down the line. As soon as the bishop, the Episcopal bishop, the head one says we're good to go, we'll be coming from Christ Church Cranbrook. So there's lots of opportunities into the future. I am sorry that I lost you today. I have no idea what happened. Facebook just completely shut down. The battery was charged. I had full internet connection. The app closed down and would not reopen. So I hope that it saved the first half of the tour. If not, just feel blessed that you clicked in on time to be able to see it live. Again, I'm your curator, Kevin Adkisson, coming to you from as part of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, continued ways of getting involved and learning more about the art and architecture of Cranbrook. See you next Wednesday at the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House, or if you have Instagram, Tuesday and Thursday at 5 o'clock for shorter tours there. And I'll leave you with one of George Booth's favorite quotes: "A life without beauty is only half lived," the great beauty arch. So I hope that everyone is doing well, is feeling okay, being safe, staying home, listening to our leaders about what the best course of action is in this strange time. See you next week, everyone.